The rig arrived on a flatbed at 4 in the morning, chains rattling like a hanged man's boots. By sunup, its mast stood 40 feet over the Kessler pasture, black against a sky already bleached white with heat. Emmett Kessler stood beneath it in a soaked collar, watching the bit bite into caliche rock that hadn't seen a drill since the Dust Bowl. Grasshoppers clicked in the dead Johnson grass. His cattle, ribs showing through hide, watched from the fence line like a jury. Somewhere behind him, his wife Cora stood with a hand shading her eyes, saying nothing at all. By noon, 3 trucks had slowed on the county road just to look. Men leaned out windows, grinning under seed corn caps, calling out numbers, 100 feet, 200, more than any well within 40 miles of Marrow Creek. Emmett didn't answer them. He just watched the drill stem sink, foot by foot, into money he didn't have. His daughter Junie sat on the porch rail that evening, counting the mule-drawn hay bales they hadn't bought, and asked her mother why Daddy was digging a hole so deep it might come out the other side of the earth. Cora had no answer for her either. Only the drill kept turning, long after dark, long after sense. Before we get further into why a half-ruined rancher in the driest summer Texas had seen in 60 years was pouring his last dollar straight down into the ground, I'd love it if you hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what part of the country you're watching from tonight. It helps this channel more than you know, and I read every single one. Marrow Creek sat in the flat red dirt of Ochiltree County, up where the Texas Panhandle meets the Oklahoma line, a town of one blinking stoplight, a feed store, and a Baptist church with a steeple you could see from 3 roads over. In a good year, wheat stood green to the horizon, and the creek that gave the town its name actually ran. This was not a good year. This was the 3rd summer of drought running, the kind old-timers measured against 1956 and found worse. Stock tanks had cracked into mosaic. Wells that had fed 3 generations of Ochiltree families were coughing up mud instead of water. The Kesslers had it harder than most. Emmett's father had mortgaged the home place twice, and Emmett had inherited both the land and the debt, along with 60 head of cattle that were now losing pounds by the week. Cora kept the household running on flour biscuits and garden tomatoes too small to sell, and every night she totaled figures in a ledger by the stove light, the numbers never once coming out in their favor. She remembered, as a girl, her own mother doing the same arithmetic during a drier decade, and she remembered her mother's hands shaking the exact same way Emmett's did now over the well-drilling invoice. Junie was 8, and to her the drought meant no swimming hole, no green anywhere, and a father who came in from the fields each evening looking older than he had that morning. She kept a coffee can of rainwater on the porch from the one shower they'd gotten in April, guarding it like treasure, refusing to let anyone touch it. It was a child's ritual, but it was also, without either of them saying so, the same instinct driving her father, the hoarding of water against a world determined to take it. Cora watched her daughter guard that can and thought, he comes by it honest. At the feed store, the ridicule had a name and a face. Hollis Rankin, who ran the co-op and held paper on half the ranchers in the county. Hollis had watched 3 of his own borrowers go under to the drought already, and he made no secret of expecting Emmett to be the 4th. Man drills a well 4 times deeper than his neighbors while his cattle are starving, Hollis said to a crowded counter one Tuesday, loud enough to carry. That's not faith, Emmett. That's just throwing good money into a hole and calling it a plan. A few men laughed. Emmett bought his feed sack and said nothing, the way a man does when arguing costs more than he has left. It hadn't started as a well at all, not in Emmett's mind. It had started with his grandfather's old geology books, water-stained, and 40 years out of print, kept in a trunk in the barn loft. As a boy, Emmett used to read them by lantern light while his father slept off a hard day, tracing his finger over hand-drawn cross-sections of the Ogallala Aquifer, the great underground sea that fed the whole high plains. One diagram, penciled in his grandfather's own hand, showed something the other diagrams didn't. A second, older water table far below the first, sealed under a shelf of red bed shale most drillers never bothered to punch through. Every well in Merrow Creek, including the one his own father had drilled in 1961, tapped the upper Ogallala, the shallow sheet of water lying under all their land alike, drying together, rising together, a shared bathtub with everyone's straw in it. His grandfather had believed, and written in cramped pencil in the margin, that a well drilled straight through the shale shelf into the older formation beneath would strike water that didn't rise and fall with the rest of the county's wells at all, water that answered to a different, deeper rhythm the drought couldn't touch as easily. Emmett had carried that idea, unspoken, for 20 years. He hired Delmer Voss, an itinerant driller out of Beaver County, Oklahoma, known for taking on jobs other outfits called impossible. Delmer studied the old cross-section for a long while, chewing his lip before agreeing to try. "You understand," Delmer told him on the first morning, boots planted in the red dust. "Most fellas paying me to drill 400 feet want oil, not water. You're asking me to punch through shale nobody around here punches through. Could hit dry rock the whole way down. Could hit nothing at all." Emmett only nodded and told him to start the rig. The cost came to nearly everything Emmett had left savings, a small inheritance from Cora's aunt, and a loan against equipment he still owed money on. Worse, the timing could not have been crueler. 6 weeks earlier, the bank had extended Emmett's mortgage on one hard condition. He carried drought indemnity insurance on his herd, the only thing keeping the loan afloat, and the policy required proof of a reliable year-round water source, certified by a county agricultural inspector within 60 days, or the policy would lapse, and with it, the loan extension. The inspection was already circled in red on Cora's calendar. 31 days remained when the drill bit first touched ground. For 3 weeks the rig turned steadily through rock, through clay, through dry red shale that came up in dinner plate slabs and found nothing, not a trace of moisture. Emmett walked out to the site every evening after chores, running the dry cuttings through his fingers, saying little. Delmer grew quieter too, the confident tilt gone out of his hat. Then on day 22, with 11 days left before the inspector's visit, the drive shaft seized entirely, a cracked bearing, no replacement part closer than Amarillo, 3 days out even by rush freight. The rig sat silent under the sun. For the first time since the trucks began slowing on the road, Emmett looked like a beaten man. That night Cora found him on the porch step long after dark, Junie's coffee can of rainwater sitting untouched beside him. He told her plainly that he'd been a fool, that Holly's was right, that he'd bet the family's whole future on a pencil drawing made by a dead man who'd never once seen it proven. Cora sat beside him a long while before she spoke. She reminded him that his grandfather had never been wrong about this land in 40 years of farming it, and that a cracked bearing wasn't the ground telling him no, it was just a bearing. In the morning, Emmett drove to Amarillo himself rather than wait on freight, and came back with the part by nightfall. Delmer had the rig turning again by sunrise, and this time the shale gave way faster than either man expected, as though the layer had been thinning the whole while, waiting them out. On the 28th day, with 3 left on the calendar, the bit dropped through the shale shelf entirely, and the drive stem shuddered in a way Delmer said he'd felt only twice before in his life. Water came up the casing that afternoon, not a trickle, but a hard, steady column, cold enough to fog the pipe in 90-degree heat, clear as bottled water even before the sediment settled. Delmer just stood there a moment, hat off, before he said anything at all. Word of the strike didn't reach town that week. Emmett kept it quiet, capped the well and ran the water only to his own troughs and one holding tank, still half expecting some catch to reveal itself. The inspector came on schedule, tested flow rate and clarity for the better part of an hour, and signed the certification without a single question. The insurance held. The loan held. And for a few days, the well was simply Emmett's own private, unremarkable miracle, until the drought did what droughts do, and pressed harder still on everybody else's straw in that shared, shrinking bathtub underground. It was Holly's Rankin himself who found out first, and not by anyone telling him. Driving the county road at dawn to check his own dying stock tank, he slowed instead at the Kessler fence line and stopped the truck outright. Green. Not much, but green, a ring of it around a trough brimming full, cattle standing knee-deep and drinking their fill while every other pasture for miles lay the color of a paper sack. He sat behind the wheel a long moment, engine idling, staring at water where there should have been dust, before he got out and walked the fence line just to be sure his eyes weren't lying to him. Within 2 days, the story had crossed every kitchen table and church pew in Ochiltree County, not from Emmett's mouth but from the sight of it. Wells that had served since the 50s gave out one after another that same week, the shallow aquifer dropping past what any pump could reach, and ranchers who'd laughed at the rig now stood at Emmett's gate with stock trailers and water tanks, asking, hat off, whether he'd sell them water or better, tell them where a man might find a driller willing to go as deep as Delmer Voss had gone. Emmett sold water at cost to anyone who asked, and gave it free to the ones who couldn't pay. By the following spring, 4 other wells in the county reached down through that same shale shelf, guided by the cross-section Emmett finally let folks copy out of his grandfather's trunk. The rains came back eventually, the way they always had before, but by then Marrow Creek had learned something the rain couldn't teach, that the water everyone shared on the surface wasn't the only water there was, and that the man they'd mocked for digging past sense had simply been listening to a page nobody else had bothered to read. Holly's Rankin still runs the co-op counter, though these days he tells the story on himself before anyone else can. Junie kept her coffee can on the porch rail for years afterward, though she never needed to hoard rainwater again. Emmett would find it there sometimes and leave it be. Folks in Ochiltree County still point out the Kessler well to newcomers, not for its depth anymore, but for what it proved, that the driest year on record couldn't touch water that had the good sense to run deeper than everybody's trouble.